At 8:42 hours Tehran time in the Arabian Sea, 80 nautical miles off the Iranian coast, the comm aboard the USS Frank E. Peterson Jr. was suddenly broken by a piercing alarm. The destroyer's AN/S-PY-6 radar had detected a Shahed 139 following a highly unusual flight path. The aircraft skimmed just above the surface of the sea, moving in an unpredictable zigzag pattern before abruptly climbing to 15,000 feet. Its electro-optical and infrared sensors then appeared to focus on the USS Abraham Lincoln. 3 radio warnings were transmitted, but no response followed. Within moments, an American F-35C call sign Anvil 1 moved to intercept. An AIM-9X missile launched from its rail, and a bright flash illuminated the waters of the Arabian Sea. Inside the CENTCOM Operations Center, officers briefly believed the situation had been contained. What appeared to be a limited provocation seemed to be over. Then something completely unexpected happened. The Aegis combat system was suddenly flooded with hundreds of phantom contacts. Before the drone disappeared, it had apparently released electronic decoys and malicious code, overwhelming the defense network with a storm of false data. One red contact became 500 nearly identical signals. The American fleet could no longer determine which targets were real and which existed only inside the radar system. At the same time, the United States BIRSGEO early warning satellite detected an enormous thermal signature. 25 concealed silo doors hidden within the Zagros Mountains had opened almost simultaneously. The F-35 pilot quickly understood that the interception had not ended the threat. Instead, it may have activated the opening phase of a swarm operation unlike anything previously documented in NATO intelligence reports. What was approaching the fleet? Could the Fifth Fleet regain control of the situation, or was the USS Abraham Lincoln about to face one of the most serious challenges in its operational history? The answer would emerge within the next 13 minutes and could permanently change how modern naval warfare is understood. Less than 90 seconds after the mid-air explosion, the waters below erupted into motion. Taking advantage of the disruption affecting the American Aegis radar network, 20 Pekin III-class fast-attack craft surged out from camouflage positions along the Iranian coastline. They did not approach in a direct formation. Instead, the vessels accelerated in erratic zigzag patterns, weaving between commercial oil tankers moving through the Strait of Hormuz. This created an extremely complex challenge for the fire control systems aboard the American destroyers. The AN/SPY-6 radar, despite being among the most advanced systems ever deployed at sea, now had to separate genuine threats from an overwhelming maze of signals. Fishing vessels, commercial tankers, fast attack craft, and electronic decoys all appeared inside the same crowded battle space. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard was using the heavy traffic of the Strait of Hormuz to create uncertainty, forcing American crews to delay their response because any mistake could place nearby civilian vessels at risk. Then, an urgent transmission arrived from an RC-135V rivet joint electronic intelligence aircraft operating high above the region. The report finally explained the earlier behavior of the Shahed aircraft. Signals intelligence specialists had decoded the final data package transmitted by the drone before it was intercepted. The purpose of its optical targeting system was not simply to observe the aircraft carrier. It was recording the exact satellite coordinates of the moving USS Abraham Lincoln. Its sudden climb to 15,000 feet had also been deliberate. The drone had been measuring wind speed, humidity, and air density at the altitude through which an incoming missile payload would later descend. The two critical data sets, the carrier's exact coordinates and the atmospheric conditions above the region, were combined into a complete firing solution. That information was then transferred directly into the inertial navigation system of the land-based Khalij Fars anti-ship ballistic missile. During its final descent, the missile could reach approximately Mach 3. With precise information about wind speed, humidity, and air density, its expected margin of error could be reduced to less than 5 meters. For Carrier Strike Group 3, the situation had suddenly become far more dangerous. The fleet was trapped between two rapidly developing threats. A formation of high-speed boats was closing in at short range, while electronic interference disrupted the radar picture. At the same time, multiple anti-ship ballistic missiles appeared to be preparing for launch, with highly accurate targeting information already loaded into their guidance systems. The American ships now faced an almost impossible tactical choice. If they lowered their radar coverage to track the smaller vessels near the surface, they could reduce their ability to detect threats descending from high altitude. But if they concentrated entirely on the sky, the fast-moving craft could continue closing the distance. Could the American fleet find a way out of this carefully coordinated trap? Share your answer by commenting 1 if you believe it could. With time running out, the 5th Fleet commander made a decisive move to break the two-sided pressure. The destroyers were ordered to hold their main weapons in order to reduce the risk to nearby commercial vessels. Instead, a squadron of MH-60R Seahawk helicopters launched with APKWS laser-guided rockets. The helicopters positioned themselves above the fast-moving formation and released their rockets at an angle of approximately 70 degrees. This approach was designed to direct the impact downward and limit the danger to surrounding ships. The compact guided rockets struck the engine sections of the Pekin-class craft with highly controlled precision. The damage remained concentrated around the intended targets, while the enormous oil tankers passing only a few dozen meters away were left untouched. Within moments, the immediate surface threat had been neutralized. The Aegis-equipped destroyers could now redirect their radar energy toward the sky and prepare for the possible arrival of ballistic missiles. Meanwhile, the air operation shifted to another urgent objective, locating and disabling the command network behind the earlier drone mission. An E-2D, Advanced Hawkeye Airborne Command aircraft, used its UHF radar and electronic sensors to search deep inside Iranian territory for the source of the control transmissions connected to the Shahed aircraft. Using triangulation, analysts identified what appeared to be a ground control station hidden in a remote valley near Bandar Abbas. 4 F-35 aircraft carrying GBU-53B Stormbreaker glide bombs were immediately assigned to the mission. Their objective was to disrupt the communication network before updated coordinates could be transmitted to the missile guidance systems. The F-35C formation approached in a low observable configuration. From approximately 40 miles away, the glide bombs were released from the internal weapons bays. The weapons moved silently through the air before reaching the radar antennas and command vehicles below. A rapid series of flashes appeared across the valley. On American monitoring screens, the electronic signals from the area suddenly disappeared. For a brief moment, the United States forces believed the control network had been successfully disabled. But the silence did not mean the operation was over. It was only the pause before the next phase began. As the F-35C pilots reported that the objective had been completed and started closing their weapons bays, warning systems inside all 4 cockpits activated almost simultaneously. The situation had reversed in seconds. The radar stations struck in the valley were not the primary control sites. They were inexpensive decoy transmitters placed there to attract an American response. Iranian forces had been waiting for the aircraft to release their weapons. During the brief moment when the internal bays opened, the aircraft's radar signature became easier to detect. Only a few seconds were available, but that was enough for the concealed air defense network to begin tracking the formation. From the limestone caves surrounding the decoy site, concealed hatches suddenly opened. Hidden inside was a battery of Bavar 373 long-range surface-to-air systems, an extensively upgraded platform based on the S-300 design. Within seconds, their electronically scanned phased array radars came online and began tracking the newly exposed position of the American formation. 4 Shahed 4B interceptor missiles immediately accelerated into the night sky at nearly Mach 6, leaving bright trails that stretched across the darkness. For the pilots, the timing could not have been worse. They were being tracked at close range just as their aircraft were transitioning out of their most vulnerable configuration. The Bavar 373 radar followed the infrared signatures of the F-35C engines as the pilots increased speed and attempted to leave the area. The Black Knight squadron immediately separated. Each pilot began a series of intense high-G evasive maneuvers. Their bodies were pressed firmly into their seats as they released waves of flares and chaff, attempting to confuse the approaching missile guidance systems. Within moments, the sky above the Gulf of Oman became a maze of glowing countermeasures, twisting aircraft and long smoke trails. The American formation had temporarily lost control of the engagement, but Iran's operation was not finished. With much of the 5th Fleet's attention divided between protecting the aircraft overhead and responding to the fast-moving vessels near the surface, Tehran initiated another coordinated move from an unexpected direction. Several apparently harmless Panama-flagged cargo ships were anchored offshore. Without warning, the tops of multiple shipping containers opened. They were not carrying ordinary commercial goods. Hidden inside were carefully disguised mobile launch systems. Dozens of Shahed 136 one-way attack drones launched almost simultaneously. They gathered into a dark formation and flew just above the surface of the water at an altitude of less than 10 meters. Unlike the earlier Shahed reconnaissance aircraft, this formation did not depend on continuous radar guidance. The drones followed pre-programmed inertial and satellite navigation coordinates, approaching the port side of the USS Abraham Lincoln, where the defensive coverage appeared to be less concentrated. The American fleet was suddenly confronted with more targets than its defensive systems could easily manage at once. Even the advanced processors of the Aegis network faced an enormous challenge. Available sensors and defensive resources had to be divided between three separate directions: high-speed missiles approaching from land, fast vessels operating near the surface, and a large drone formation arriving from the carrier's flank. The Phalanx close-in defense systems rapidly turned toward the approaching contacts, but their coverage could not reach every angle simultaneously. Iran's coordinated strategy had stretched the American layered defense network across multiple fronts. The first Shahed drones had already crossed the outer defensive boundary and were now only seconds away from reaching the carrier. At that critical moment, just as the Phalanx systems aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln prepared to respond, a calm order came from the Combat Direction Center. Cancel kinetic engagement. Activate the Silent Fry protocol. The Shahed 4B missiles were still following the F-35C formation. Launching additional interceptor weapons was considered too dangerous because friendly aircraft were operating inside the same confined airspace. Instead, two EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft suddenly crossed behind the formation. Their AN/ALQ-218 sensor systems began analyzing the communication link connecting the Iranian ground radar to the missile guidance network. In a fraction of a second, the Growlers introduced deceptive information into the transmission channel. The result was immediate and unexpected. On the Iranian monitoring screens, the four missiles still appeared to be following the American aircraft. In reality, the Shahed 4B interceptors had begun drifting away from their intended paths. They passed behind the F-35Cs and continued toward false coordinates before becoming inactive in the distance. At almost the same moment, the approaching Shahed 136 formation met a very different kind of defense. The American destroyers did not launch a single conventional weapon. The SLQ-32 Block 3 electronic warfare system mounted on the command tower released a concentrated high-power microwave pulse across the approaching drone formation. The response was immediate. Electronic components inside the Shahed aircraft began failing almost simultaneously. Navigation chips stopped functioning, control systems went offline, and dozens of drones racing toward the carrier suddenly became unstable. One after another, they dropped into the sea approximately 2 nautical miles from the carrier's hull. Rather than relying on conventional interceptors, the American fleet had used directed energy technology to disable the formation, leaving the remaining drone components scattered across the surface of the water. The first wave had been stopped, but the most serious threat was still developing. The SBIRS early warning satellite issued a priority alert. Launch hatches connected to the Khalij Fars ballistic missile complex in the Zagros Mountains were now open. Intelligence estimates suggested that only 3 minutes remained before a group of high-speed anti-ship missiles could leave their underground positions. At such a short distance, the Aegis defense network could not guarantee that every incoming object would be intercepted. The fleet's best chance was to disable the launch complex before the missiles could be released. But the facility was hidden approximately 50 meters beneath solid granite. Standard Tomahawk cruise missiles were unlikely to reach the protected sections of the base. The only available weapons capable of reaching that depth were GBU-72 bunker-penetrating bombs. Delivering them from high altitude, however, would expose the aircraft to the dense Panzer S-1 defensive network surrounding the region. The fleet commander was left with one extremely risky option. 2 F-35 aircraft that had narrowly escaped the earlier engagement were already running low on fuel. Instead of returning directly to the carrier, they turned back toward the coastline. The aircraft descended to less than 100 meters and began following the shape of the terrain to remain below radar coverage. Flying at approximately Mach 0.9, the two fighters entered the Zagros mountain range, using valleys and ridgelines to conceal their approach. As soon as Iranian observation posts noticed the dark shapes moving through the valley, the short-range defensive network came online. 23mm systems and portable interceptors began responding throughout the narrow mountain corridor. Inside the cockpits, terrain warning alerts sounded repeatedly. The pilots were forced to navigate between steep rock walls while continuing toward a single critical point, a 5-meter-wide concrete ventilation shaft concealed along the mountainside. According to intelligence data, this shaft was the only direct route leading into the underground storage area. Anvil 1 approaching the objective, maximum power. The lead F-35 suddenly climbed away from the valley floor in a rapid pop-up maneuver. The aircraft briefly exposed its position in order to achieve the required release angle. At approximately 3,000 feet, the pilot activated the weapons system. The 2.5-ton GBU-72 separated from the aircraft and began descending under precision guidance toward the narrow ventilation opening. Moments later, the weapon entered the dark shaft. The F-35 immediately released its remaining countermeasures and descended sharply along the mountainside as two infrared-guided interceptors approached from behind. 3 seconds later, the terrain beneath the Zagros Mountains began to shake. The GBU-72 had traveled through the ventilation structure and reached the storage area containing solid missile propellant. A massive internal chain reaction followed. Instead of missiles emerging from the open launch hatches, enormous columns of heat, dust, and concrete fragments surged upward as pressure moved through the underground tunnels. Within moments, the hidden launch facility had been rendered inoperable from the inside. "Objective neutralized," confirmed the calm voice of the MQ-9 operator. At sea, the Iranian warship lost contact with its command network and began withdrawing from the area. Aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln, the all-clear signal finally sounded, but no one celebrated. The flight deck crew stood in silence as two F-35 aircraft returned to the carrier, their outer surfaces marked by visible damage from the intense mission. The fleet had made it through the confrontation, but the margin had been extremely narrow. Then the full assessment arrived, revealing that the situation was far from resolved. The air operation had disabled only Site A. New satellite imagery showed that Site B and Site C, located approximately 50 kilometers away, remained active. Their underground hatches were still open, while mobile ballistic missile launchers were already dispersing across the region to avoid detection. The United States had stopped the first major wave and protected the aircraft carrier, but the success had come at a strategic cost. During the operation, the fleet had revealed some of its most closely guarded electronic warfare capabilities. Tehran had lost an important facility, yet it had also demonstrated something significant. The defensive zone surrounding the American carrier group was no longer impossible to challenge. The operation officially ended at 10:15 hours. In Washington, senior military officials understood that this was not a final conclusion. It was only the opening round of a new strategic confrontation, one in which the familiar rules had begun to disappear. And as the crews continued watching their displays, new red contacts slowly started appearing on the radar screens.